Hi there, and welcome back to Culturally Sound. Really appreciate you jumping in this week. We have a interesting story ahead with Stratten Walt from Baobab Partners. He's a co-founder in a company that's focused on building scalable enterprise applications through software and sort of focused on more of what they need as opposed to prescribing what um, they should have, I guess. Is that I think you can articulate a lot better. So let's just hand it
Sure.
over. Yeah.
Thank you, Chandler. So yeah, Baobab Partners, we are a boutique consulting firm founded with myself and my partner uh, about 5 or 6 years now, and focusing primarily on custom software development, CRM or business management platform implementation, and custom applications, and a number of different things, right? We're pretty technology agnostic. Um, what we primarily do is work with small and medium-sized businesses to understand what they're doing and hopefully put in place processes, hopefully put in place systems that help them do what they're doing better, right? And I can give you a couple of examples, but for one, right, we do CRM implementation. So often companies that are just currently using spreadsheets to run their businesses, and you'd be shocked at how many businesses get to a pretty decent size just running that way. And it's in spite of the tools that they're using, almost never because of them. Right. And it's both impressive and concerning in some ways, because I'm like, you just must not sleep or have a life.
Right.
And that's
Yeah.
often the case, right? And so one of the, for example, right, I remember one of my earliest projects was working with a small, I say small, but they were a $40 million a year company doing self-storage manufacturing facilities or self-storage facilities on behalf of others, right? So
Okay.
if you wanted to go and open up five ample storage centers in Raleigh, North Carolina, and they wouldn't be ample because obviously that's, a separate company, but like you wanted to own five storage centers in North Carolina as a way of doing passive income, um, and increasing your portfolio, these are the guys that you would go to. And we send them off, as we do with every client, a questionnaire, kind of asking them to walk us through their processes, what systems they have in place, what are they currently doing to keep track of things, what are their operations like on the back end, and they kind of send it back blank. And we're thinking like a lot of companies do that, right? Where they don't want to take the time to write it out, or they don't have somebody on
Sure.
staff who can do that. They're just going to walk us through what they do on a disco call and will effectively act as secretary. And that's honestly fine, right? That's just part of what we do. It's kind of like going to a therapist. You may not always send them the questionnaire ahead of time. You'll just kind of tell them what your issues are when you
Full
when you get
intake
there for the
form.
first session.
Yeah.
So we're like, okay, that's we've dealt with that before. But they come in and they say, "Oh, we were taking a look at that form you were doing, and well, you asked us a lot of questions about our processes, and the thing is, we were kind of thinking about it and realizing we don't really have any, so we were hoping you could help us out with that." And again, this is a $40 million company with like 85 employees. They're
Right.
doing pretty well. They've done projects in like 30 something countries around the world somehow. I don't know how they did. And their CRM was a spreadsheet that had been continuously running since about 1996
Hmm.
that had more than 400,000 rows that their secretary just kind of kept a running tally of. It, granted, she was amazing at what she did, but she was getting 75, 80 at the time.
Oh
And
boy.
that was not a sustainable system or
Right.
lack thereof. And so she would just add rows, add rows, add rows, and just kind of knew where she was. And we're like, all right, well, you don't have a database, you don't have a book of clients, you have a spreadsheet of about 80 different data types. We need to fix that because you are one power surge away from losing
Whole lot.
everything. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so like part of what we did was one, understand what they were doing, but also sort of help them de-risk themselves,
Hmm.
where, okay, we're going to understand your processes. We're going to help you define what they are, right? And help understand why it is that, say, 15% of their salespeople were really, really good and had been there for 10 years plus, but they had a super high churn for about 50% because they just either didn't pick things up quickly enough, but they didn't have a good onboarding process. They were just kind of relying on people being naturally good at sales
Hmm.
and pairing them up for like an arbitrary amount of time while they learned the ropes. And some people took to that really well. Some people didn't. Most didn't. And so helping them fix that problem too. But it was a lot of kind of helping them break down their business and helping them understand what it was they were actually doing well and what it was that they were doing that was actually kind of getting in their own way.
Hmm.
And so yeah, like we ended up then setting up, a Salesforce instance for them. We ended up setting off an external database for them. We went through the different things that you do when you do this, but ultimately, right, what we were kind of go back to the therapist example, but we were kind of playing therapist to their business,
Yeah.
um,
Well,
and
strategy.
helping them put, yeah, exactly, helping them
Yeah.
put plans and strategies in place to like to have a plan and a strategy because they
Mm.
don't have one. They just kind of got where they were accidentally. Um, and so one, we de-risk them, but also I think one of the most rewarding things kind of from that, and I kind of go back to this a lot, but with their salespeople, they would often spend 3, 4 hours a day on the end of a Friday compiling their notes again into a spreadsheet that they would
Hmm.
review on their Monday morning sales calls.
Hmm.
That was time they weren't spending with their families. That was time they weren't um, getting to do things they wanted. And they also just didn't have an understanding of like where should they be focusing their efforts. They weren't able to break down like what are our most valuable zip codes? What is the
Yeah.
profile of somebody who actually works out? They were just going by feel. And I know salespeople love to go by feel. And that often works for them, right? They're very intuitive people. But to help kind of back that up with data and to gut check that and help them also like know where to apply that intuition makes a big difference for them, such that, a year or two, about a year after, their sales were up 15% from the work that we did with them, partly
Mm.
because they knew where to focus their efforts, right? The
Hmm.
project for them paid for themselves many, many times over very quickly, but we also got personal thank yous from a couple of the salespeople saying, thank you, but this is so much easier than what we were doing before. I get to go to my kids' game on the weekends because I don't have to fill out those reports.
Hmm.
And it's like it's ultimately one of the things that I kind of want to keep in mind with whatever we do is how can we make the systems that we put up, the things that we put in place and improve for our clients, not just have a numerical impact, but also an experiential one, because and this sounds a little bit practical, but people who get a better experience working with tools are more likely to use them, therefore making the tool more valuable. And
Right.
so it becomes one of those, virtuous feedback loops.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So you've covered an incredible amount of ground just in that one story. I mean, um, technology implementation, employee retention processes, awareness of systems that are in place. You know, this is just how we always do it.
Hmm.
Like there's so many things. Typically, and I didn't want to stop you. Like there's so many threads to pull on just in that one story.
Sure.
And I mean, what you sort of closed with describing the the emotional impact of the work that you're doing with the company is, and who would look at a business that's focused on scalable enterprise applications and say that there's, a cultural element to that business. And I think you've touched on there's cultural elements to any business in how it's applied if it's done through with or through a lens of humanity. And I feel like humanity is often misunderstood when it's used at a sort of a high level of where's your humanity, and that's really not what I'm going for. What I'm going for is the interrelationships that are focused upon with the systems and the intention behind the processes that are built and set in place. And I think you interwove that into what you shared really, really eloquently. How did you get here? Like, what experiences did you have in life where this became important to you?
Sure. So for my background, right, I graduated from college in 2013, and then I was in the Army for a couple of years, right? I was in the engineering corps, which I think fits kind of well into what we do as far as we're not building training facilities, we're not building buildings, but it's the same idea. You have foundations, you have structures that you want to plan out and put in place first, and then but ultimately, right, you start with the why, right? You start with
Hmm.
why is it that we're doing this? What is the desired outcome? And kind of keeping that in mind and keeping that as a frame as you build things, right? As you kind of begin the work. And so I was in the army for a while. Finished that about 2016, early 2017, and was back in my college town doing bartending and kind of doing like a little bit of like, I'm not gonna lie, like BS startup stuff on the
Sure.
side, right? Just like mostly because I had been connected to the entrepreneurship community at my university. And so it was just kind of like helping out with a couple of random projects. Not that any of them were going to go anywhere, but just like pursuing some random ideas.
Hmm.
Um, and while I was bartending on one of the game days, ran into a friend of mine who had been in the army, was in the army program at the school, was a couple of years ahead of me, but had taken sort of the more traditional standard consulting route. So went to the National Guard, worked for Accenture right out of school. Really good guy. But said kind of but a couple of years ahead of me in his career and said, um, I'm back in after the game, but like, what are you doing? And I said, I'm just doing I'm doing this to live, but I'm working on like a couple of random startup things on the side. And he said, well, if like if a steadier income, if a more like sustainable income and a more standardized career is something that you may have any interest in, as well as just like getting some more technology skills, I'd recommend checking out a couple of different platforms and getting certifications in them. And he did that. And so, and I did that, right? So he recommended like Salesforce, he recommended Zoho, recommended Dynamics, and a couple of other things that said like, look, consulting firms love people who are in the army. They love people who are able to kind of structure and think things through the way an army officer typically is supposed to do, and just has an attitude of getting stuff done. And so I did that, right? Went out, got a couple of certifications, took me a month or two while I was bartending and was doing a product demo at a gym. And one of the people there happened to be a recruiter, and we got to talking. And she said, like, okay, you know, what are you cool that you're doing this, but like, you went to Duke. Do you know anybody, from that school that has a Salesforce admin certification? I was like, uh, actually, I do. Um, Funny you say that because it'd been like 2 weeks before. She's like, oh, great. There's this company that I need to connect you with in, at the time, I think it was Cary, North Carolina. And she was like, just go, I'll introduce you, but um, really want to get you set up with them. And so I did that and ended up working with this company called Idle Tools. And they were great, great group of people. They were about 16 people at the time. Phenomenal, uh, phenomenal company culture. And just, I think that's kind of where I kind of harken back to for they were so focused on the outcome. They were so
Hmm.
focused on the why of like, whatever we're doing, great, but it also like it should have an impact on the companies that we work with. Um, that's something that has stuck with me, and in fact, kind of influenced my next couple of career moves after them because I worked with them for about 18 months, but then ended up having another recruiter reach out to me for a much bigger consulting firm, right? For Tata Consulting Services, TCS. Um, and just a very different company culture, right? And so ended up getting a job with them for really just kind of an offer that I really couldn't turn down relative to what I
Okay.
was making, and also they couldn't afford to match, and I totally understood that, and they understood that. We parted on very good terms. Um, but like, no, they're like, "No, this makes sense as the next stage in your career, right? As somebody who also doesn't like want to stay in North Carolina, you're going to have expenses that like we can't like don't work with us as far as like our expenditures."
Mhm.
Um, which okay, cool. So ended up working for TCS for about a year. And the first project that I was on, they sent me down to Miami, which sounds great, right? But one of the things that I kind of really value is living where I live. And at the time, I had kind of just been in the middle of move up to New York, Jersey City, that area,
Mhm.
and where I still am, because it had been home. It's kind of where I grew up and was always where I wanted to come back to. So I actually, and I never thought I'd say this as a New Yorker, but I really liked Jersey City. I think it's a great town. I've really enjoyed being there, and
Okay.
may move back at some point. I live in Manhattan now, but it, it's where I want to be at least like half of the month. And
Okay.
so one of the things that they had kind of recruited me on was like, while the company rule is generally 3 to 4 weeks of travel per month, our practice takes that a little bit more loosely, especially if you're doing a good job. Um, and I set this as something that we'll come back to in just a moment. But so
Mhm.
they send me to Miami and they're like, okay, for the first like 2 months, probably you'll have to be on site every week, which is totally fine. And then you'll be able to draw that back down. And I came in kind of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed because one, coming from the army, right, which is a massive organization, there's a lot of inertia. Things can be very, very slow to move, but ultimately you have at least the vast majority of people believe in the mission, right? So things might
Mhm.
move forward slowly, but they do move forward. And you have people that are pushing to move things forward. If you have a new training facility that needs to be built, you do that. If you have a new range that needs to be constructed, you have people that are going to do that. There's going to be logistical challenges, but ultimately everybody's going to help kind of push through the paperwork through. And that was not necessarily the case at DCS, right? So
Interesting.
I'm in
Okay.
bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and like I ended up being the sort of the senior BA working with their customer care team. And so ended up lovely group of people doing 2 week sprints with them where we would work on all these amazing features, not little improvements, but like things that would make a real difference to them. Like, hey,
Mhm.
our we've got like 20 minutes of wasted time every day on our call that our call people go through because the flows aren't structured correctly, right? Or we don't, can we auto populate this because it's information that's already on their contact, and little things like little just connecting the dots more or less.
Yep.
Um, and so we would do kind of the preliminary work necessary to do that. And then we would get into front of what's called the change approval board, right? The committee of people that have to approve anything going to production prior to doing that. And that usually is cross-functional. So you have people who are from support, you have people from sales, you have people from finance, administration, the above, and they kind of have to bless off on anything that is going to go live. But the problem is the culture of the company that we were working with was such that everybody sort of needed to feel like they were making their mark. And if they didn't, they tended to hold things up. So you'd have changes that should have been improved that got held up just because somebody said, hey, I need to see what this was before, so that I can see this deployed down. Like, but the previous version was never live. So it shouldn't be relevant to this. Can we please get this approved? And ultimately, they would typically end up saying things like, oh, I'm just not comfortable with that. I just want to be sure that we have all of our I's dotted and T's crossed. I'm like, okay, sure. Um, and just that kind of inertia, that kind of like people didn't, not everybody, because there were a number of people who were strongly committed to trying to get
Mhm.
this going, but the
Mhm.
company was very much pushing against itself because you had a
Right.
bunch of people who were like, they didn't want the thing to move forward unless it was successful and it had their name attached to it in some
Just
way.
personal interest.
Of course, right? Because
Yeah.
they're kind of, and again, I use this not as a derogatory term, but they were mid-level managers, which is you have some that are great,
Yeah.
but some that are very much trying to stand out in a crowd of 200 people like them and
Mhm.
advance and don't really care if it's with this company or another company. And they don't really care if this company is successful. They care about them being recognized and being able to get another title so that they can lateral to another firm with that as leverage, right? That's
Yeah. Yeah.
and not everybody, again, not even the majority, but enough that it really kneecapped the project
Bottleneck
overall.
the advancement. Yeah.
Yeah. So honestly, like after about 6 to 8 months of that, it just kind of wore me down. And I I still showed up for the people that like I cared about and that like seemed to be wanting to do well. But
Mhm.
ultimately I kind of mentally checked out.
Mhm.
So this was again down near Miami, but it was in this place in this little satellite town called Sunrise. And I ended up going into the office at about 8 every day, doing the work that I needed to in about 2 hours. Because again, there was so much bottlenecking that what I could
Mhm.
do as a non-project manager BA was fairly limited, short of just like sitting around and twiddling my thumbs for 6 hours. So I'd kind of leave the office every day at like 11:15 and be to the beach by about 11:45. Um, and
No,
so
sounds
that
great.
started, it does sound great for like a couple of weeks.
Other
The
than the
problem,
personal accountability to being a performer. Yeah.
yeah, a little bit, right? So I that started in about like April. The project started in October, November was my first
Mhm.
time on site. But then April, May was when I was like, there's no point in this. I don't really need to be here.
Mhm.
So I would go to the beach at Fort Lauderdale every day at that point and found myself, this was like late July of that year, just drifting in the shallows out in front of the Fort Lauderdale Hilton with like a half melted strawberry daiquiri in my hand and just hating life, right? Because it's like
Figuratively,
this feels
literally. Yeah.
so pointless. I'm being paid well and honestly doing more than almost anyone on the project, but like
Totally.
nothing is happening, right?
Yeah.
It feels like I'm in purgatory. Like a very luxurious purgatory, but it still was just like, oh, okay, now I get what ennui is. I
Right.
understand what that feeling is.
Mhm.
Um, so I started at the time, right? Like just soft looking for other opportunities, at least being open to them, talking with
Mhm.
other recruiters and whatnot. Um, but then of course that project ended up failing in like the mid fall. So about the October or so after that.
Year later.
Um, yeah, a year where very little got moved forward, very little happened. And for obvious reasons, the client did not want to continue engaging TCS. And so the project got cut and they sort of reallocated all of the resources. And this was going into winter, right? And they're like, we are going to send you to Naperville, Illinois,
Oh
going
boy.
into November. I was like, no, you're not.
Yeesh.
I was like, look, I have learned a lot. And I got to great work with some amazing people,
Mhm.
but this is, I'm realizing, not the company for me, right?
Mhm.
Even if it means making a bit less or doing whatever else. But this is not, I can't have every day feel empty. Um, so I left. I ended up just saying I quit. I didn't have any other plans, but I had a decent amount of savings because again, this going back, I spent pretty much every week on the road, right? I was there probably 43 out of the 49 weeks or so overall that
Mhm.
that project ran. So that was the other thing. I was like, look, you guys don't even kind of keep your promises. And I know it was a soft promise. I know it was just a manager who maybe not even be in that role anymore, but it's like, that's not, it's not a culture of integrity. Um, or respect for your employees. Because again, a lot of it didn't need to be there.
Mhm.
But this was like 2017, 2018, prior to remote work being a big thing. But
Mhm.
in IT, it kind of already was a thing. So it was frustrating. So I ended up leaving and just started freelancing so as not to like burn through savings and just kind of see what was going on.
Sure.
And yeah, I was on Upwork, was on, you know, recruiter.com, I was in Indeed, on all those different places, just like looking for like low grade, honestly, projects, just things to kind of keep my skills sharp. And that within like a month or two became really my full-time job. Right. It was smaller stuff. It might have been like, $1,000 project, a $2,000 project, but it was execution and it
Mhm.
was things actually getting done. And granted, sometimes it was a one person instance, sometimes it was a 10-person instance, but there was a feeling of a sense of meaning or
Mhm.
value to the work
Mhm.
again.
Mhm.
Um, and so ended up uh, selling a couple of projects that I wasn't at the time technically able to deliver on. And I mean that like I didn't necessarily have some of the technical skills because while at the time I was very good with uh, flows and point and click configuration and architectural diagrams and documentation, I was not a skilled developer. That's since changed, but at the time I was like, I can't really, I sold this, but I can't really do this.
Mhm.
So, um, was looking for like freelance developers or whatnot, but like didn't really jive with any of them. And
Mhm.
so reached out to my best friend from college who I worked on a couple of projects with while I was in school. None of them went anywhere because again, most startups don't go anywhere, and especially most
It's
college
just that.
startups really don't go anywhere.
Yeah.
But they were fun things to work on, and I always enjoyed working with him, and he was technically brilliant,
Mhm.
right? Just an amazing developer. And said, hey, Midge, um, kind of sold this like, what are you doing? It's like, oh, I'm in grad school in the UK. And he was doing a master's in computer science at the time on machine learning and algorithms. And I said, hey, I sold, like, do you have free time? He's like, yeah, honestly, like it's school, but it's grad school and it's highly focused, and honestly it takes
Sure.
me like 20-30 hours a week.
Mhm.
um I was like, cool. So do you want to, I kind of sold this project. Do you know Apex, which is the coding language for Salesforce? It's just Java based.
Sure. Sure.
And it's
Proprietary
like,
Java.
yeah, with like four syntax differences. It's just
Right.
Java. They call it by a different name. Um, but I said, I do you know this? He said, no. I said, do you want to do it anyway? He's like, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, learned more or less the difference in syntax in a weekend and kind of cranked it
Before. Yeah.
out.
Cool.
And we were able to deliver. And since then, we've kind of just, you know, s- been rolling with that, right? That's
Okay.
how we started and have taken um obviously many new projects since then. But I think one of the kind of points of pride for us is something like 95% of our new business is referral driven. So it's
Mhm.
either people that leave companies that had a great experience with us and want us to do the same thing for their new companies, or references to friendly competitors of like, oh, hey, we do this in New York. This company that we know and interact with because we act as a referral source um, does the same thing in New Jersey. Here's an introduction. Start a conversation with them. They'd be
Mhm.
grateful for that. Um, or just like, this was my college buddy. He's doing this thing. Can you help him out? And I think that kind of speaks to the quality of the work that we do and kind of the difference that we make for them, that they're willing to do that consistently. And honestly, the first three clients that we have from 2018 are still with us today. So we
That's
kind of act
fascinating. Yeah.
as their IT department because they never really found a need to hire somebody in-house, and we know them so well.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and that's kind of where we are. We're like 12, 13 people or so now, and have just kind of gradually grown since then.
And do you focus on scale? Do you focus on, I mean, you'd probably grow a little faster if you focused on scale. Obviously, it's more of a quality, not quantity.
A little
So
bit, yeah.
what is what does that look like? Those learnings that you're bringing in and applying them to um, with your team.
Mhm.
How do you nurture the focus of ensuring that the the why is apparent and there's the intrinsic value to the end result as you continue?
Honestly, that's the tricky part to scale, right?
Hmm.
Because we have been pretty lucky in terms of some of our hires, but we've also had some that really have not worked out. Um, it's hard getting someone or hiring resources who are necessarily kind of as committed to excellence as we kind of want them to be as far as delivery goes. And that's no comment on them as people, but it is, hard to find people who are able to deliver the output at the quality and kind of level of focus that we feel our clients deserve, right? And honestly, that is a challenge of ours. But I think, and because it's a services business, right? Like it's hard to scale service businesses because it's very much a ladder sort of mechanism where you can't overhire in anticipation of a big project because that big project might never materialize.
Hmm.
But you also can't sell a project too much larger than what you're capable of doing because how do you bring on people you trust and are familiar with their ability to? It's honestly something like we're sort of considering and retooling right now, as in like, how do we take the work that we're doing and make it scalable
Hmm.
without getting lucky? And to that end, what we're trying to refocus on right now is taking the work that we've been doing and productizing it and turning it into tools that can be whether by us or by others or on app stores or app exchanges replicably delivered, right? I
Hmm.
think that's that, and I think that's kind of the pivot we're in the process of making at the moment, where it's like,
Interesting.
yes, we're going to continue doing excellent work for clients, but and we have the resources to do so, but growing as a services firm isn't necessarily our top priority
Okay.
because again, it's when you do that, you're very much beholden to the clients that you have, which is both a good and bad thing, right? Because if you have a big client that represents 20% of the revenue and that goes out, do you fire everybody? What if they're good resources, right? And then do you just try to hire them back again later?
Yeah.
It's a really tricky line to walk. And unfortunately, because of the way we do it with its very bespoke, very involved projects,
Hmm.
there are
Hmm.
always going to be clients that represent a disproportionate amount of our revenue, of our relationship, of our focus.
Hmm.
And that's okay. That's just sort of the nature of the business. It means we get to do more interesting things for them and with them. But again, it does mean that, yeah, like we're tied to them in a way that can be a bit challenging, right? Or
So
can be a bit challenging to grow with.
you're not alone at all
Yeah.
in those points of frustration, right? Like
Yeah.
that's and that's not to diminish the challenges that you're facing because they're real and they're legit. And whenever I hear a guest, a client, a friend say, our a majority of our leads come from referrals, that always pings something in my head. And there's nothing that's a great reflection on you as a business, but how do you manage that as a sales funnel, right? Because
Mhm.
essentially you're working as a collection of friends and you're relying on those friends to
Yep.
continue to employ you. And, that's where that challenge comes from. So, how do you develop a key product, commodity, service, whatever you want to call it, that because the difference between you and all of your competitors is you, right? So building that funnel, they're buying with you, those people continue to work with you because of you. So how do you package that into something that then can be purchased? And I mean, everyone knows the use case of Apple and Cynic's golden circles, because he sort of went through that, is they really focus on why you buy their product. So,
Yeah.
you know, scaling, what is that scale? Well, they anchored to a product and made three revisions initially, the good, the better, the best. And
Mhm.
that was it. There wasn't nine different changes or iterations or 42 different luxury layers. It was just three products, one product, three grades of quality. And then, that funnel was built, and referral was a component of it. And like you
Yeah.
said, if you have that whale that comes in, and you allocate all of your resources to it and you build your company around it, they leave. What do? You lay them off? Well, no. You've got to have that runway and that funnel to be able to support and allocate and dynamically approach what that looks like, so that you have that ability to manage that those commitments that you've made, right?
Mhm.
And maintaining that integrity. So, I mean, all of those things are.
Well, I think what you're saying is exactly correct. Of like, we could possibly, right, standardize some of the services that we offer.
An
Um,
element or three, yeah.
yeah, where, we have, I don't know, and other companies have done this and done this
Mhm,
successfully, where
mhm,
they do primarily just quick starts, right? They focus on the first 40 hours of a client's relationship with a CRM or a new system. And
mhm.
they really just do that because that's repeatable. You're not getting into technical weeds with that. It's easy to hire somebody and onboard them and give them the ability to deliver on that reliably
Yeah.
versus really getting into like deeper technical challenges.
Mhm,
But and I think part of the reason we haven't really, and you can invest, time in putting a funnel together and salespeople around that and a delivery team around that. But
mhm.
ultimately that's not, at least for me, fulfilling work, right?
Interesting.
I'm not interested in doing four objects and 50 fields and having that be, $1,800 every time, and it's going to
Yeah.
take us 15 hours of consulting. I don't know, right? It's
Yeah.
just it's
Yeah. Yeah.
not it's rote.
Yeah.
It's repetitive and it doesn't expand like me as a technician because I like learning new
Mhm,
things, but it also
mhm,
doesn't give good quality people exciting challenges. They're like they'll eventually leave that because
mhm,
like they feel like they're being wasted,
mhm,
and they wouldn't be wrong.
mhm.
So as far as like sharpening the saw, so to speak, as far as like scaling up products or turning, and like again, not to say like if that happens organically and we have somebody who just really wants to oversee that part of the operation, great. I'm not going to say no to that, but I'm not going to invest time and energy myself into pursuing that when it's better allocated elsewhere, which is I'd rather take the work that we've been doing that's really good and figuring out how can this be generalized? How can this be productized? How can we take the things that might have, say, explicit references to some of the custom code that we've done and make it something that either other consultants can configure or clients can install and set up themselves? And also, how can we sand off the rough edges, right? Like, what is it about this that works when applied for a specific client, but because they're accepting a certain level of roughness, right?
Mhm, mhm.
Because that's always going to happen with bespoke solutions unless you like really invest in like polishing and polishing and polishing. But again, for the types of clients that we're working with, they're going to say 95, 98% is
Right,
good enough.
right.
Here, go focus on this core thing next,
Mhm,
right? And so yeah, that's a more interesting challenge, taking the time to do that and also more stimulating for the people that work with us
mhm.
or us than just yeah, let's call out to 50 companies and we know that four of them are going to need quick starts and we have the same three developers that always do those things. And it's just, that feels so rote.
Yeah, yeah, not interested in the production line. So I
Yeah.
suppose like um where does that leave you with for tomorrow, right? Is it networking partner relationships where, you're with companies that are interested in doing that, and then you're picking up all of the custom work that comes off the flywheel of that quick start, where they recognize that no, we need a little bit more detailed and um, fluid components or objects or mechanisms or systems scaffold up around this space, and that partner is, well, these guys are the answer for that. Is that sort of an evolution, or what does that look like?
I mean, we have, a couple of relationships that are like that.
Hmm.
And they tend to be good ones. But like you said, right, it's very much, it's not a funnel. It's not something you
Right,
can count on.
right.
It's sort of counting on luck. And
Hmm.
so again, it's one of those things where it's like, could we maybe foster those relationships
Hmm.
and push those partners more on that? Maybe. But it's more, it's like if those develop organically, happy
Hmm.
that they do.
Sure.
Not going to turn down work, right? Um, but as far as like what I want to focus my time and attention on is,
Hmm.
one, just again, always high quality delivery. So like
Hmm.
even for that hypothetical like partner referring us to it, no, I want to make sure we deliver whatever possible as good as
Hmm.
possible.
Hmm.
Um, but as far as, we have a developer who just came off a project, hypothetical, not actual situation, but
Understood.
develop, and we don't have anything to put them on right now. Well, we've got these kind of pending outstanding items on taking the document generation solution that we built for these two clients.
Hmm.
And hey, we want to be able to support um, inserting images into the documents and specifying the dimensions as something like an arbitrary tag directly within the document itself.
Hmm. Hmm.
Well, that's an interesting challenge with several layers, right? You need to have a language transformation layer, because that's not actually like most of the different uh, frameworks like Jinja or any of the other document merging tools, any
Hmm.
Python based or whatever, aren't going to
Hmm.
recognize that. So you need a translation layer. You need some way to actually process the documents, which means maybe having an external server with something that handles the sorry, I think that might be my audio. Can I change my microphone gain? No, don't automatically. Hold on one second.
Sure.
Yeah, no, that's not wasn't obnoxious at all. Um, anyway, um, where was I?
Interesting work that comes along,
Right.
developer
That's
repurposing.
that's right. That, and like giving that person that key challenge, which has like clear desired outcomes, but
Mhm.
a not clear path to it, is more interesting and valuable. Because if they do figure it out, and we do take that now is something that, one, can be offered to the clients that are already using it, but it moves it closer to being a product that we can say, hey, this does document generation from Salesforce, from Dynamics, from whatever else. You just have to get the documents in this format.
Mhm.
And yeah, that's more satisfying at the end of the day, I think,
Okay.
is one of the key things. Um, again, never slacking on the quality of delivery for actual clients, but like that's developers are puzzle solvers ultimately, right?
Yeah.
They are people who like being given a black box and figuring out what's inside it, and then figuring out how to go from point A to point B.
Mhm.
And yeah, it helps them grow as it helps us grow, versus just purely, all right, can we churn out this project over and over and over again.
Hmm. So it just never becomes a $1 trillion company, right? It's always that boutique shop that produces a bunch of potentially integratable products that then you scale through the commodities that you design and have the ability to implement rather than.
Well, and maybe those products, right,
Mhm.
become the thing that scales and grows. And
Sure.
we put a uh, a pipeline and a BDR
Hmm.
and outbound around that.
Sure.
But that's a lot. That seems
More
like a much clearer
fulfilling.
path to me of like,
Yeah.
hey, because also you're not then like, it's not the developer who's going to be like, oh, we're doing this implementation of the same thing over and over again. It's like, well, now what else can we do with it?
Right.
What other features can we add to it? What
Right.
if we like, do we need to add support for arbitrary scripts? Do we need to have a dynamic font library downloading based on what's contained in the document? Because there's 1,000 scripts out, there's 1,000 fonts out there. Do we have to have every single one loaded on the generation server beforehand,
Right.
or can we
Hmm.
handle that more intelligently?
So how like where the common thread and seemingly it seems like every podcast the question always turns around to um you know the introduction evolution of AI and the way that that's integrated applied. I think we've come to terms with the fact that it lacks creativity and
Oh,
its
100%. Yeah.
predictive ability is a tool that can support the evolution and the future of particularly the tech space. But how does that impact that vision and where that goes and how that works and the future 5 years, 10 years out? What does that look like to you?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's hard to say 5 or 10 years out, right? And anybody
Okay.
who says they know is just completely full of it
Yeah.
because, right, LLMs, obviously, well, from a research standpoint, have been a thing for a very long time.
Hmm.
They didn't really enter the public consciousness until a year or two ago, year and a half, maybe, right? Where people's kind of minds were blown of like, look what ChatGPT can do. And that's that's really cool. But it's kind of like, how to put this, it's kind of like the web, right? Where the dot-com bubble, and I realized I was very young at this time, but like dot-com bubble came and everybody's like, oh, it's going to transform everything. And the thing is, ultimately it did, right? The web
Hmm.
is kind of where we live our lives today, but it
Hmm.
wasn't as fast and it wasn't in the way that everybody who was prognosticating at the time said. So
Yeah.
I think we're going to see a lot of that with AI, where it's going to gradually weave its way into our lives in little ways, in a way that kind of overall adds up to a massive shift. But that's not going to happen today or tomorrow.
Hmm.
Um, might happen in a few years, might happen in 20 years, who knows? But I'd say the biggest things from what we've seen so far of what AI is able to produce is its assistive technology, right? It's
Hmm.
really good if you are already able to do the thing you're asking it to do and just produce output a bit faster, right? Like, for example, writing code, it doesn't produce good code, right? It produces good code with good instructions. So if you already know how to write a really good Apex class or JS hook or whatever else, like whatever you need to produce something, or
Hmm.
you want to write a database schema file, like if you already know what that looks like and how to do that by hand, it will multiply your speed by 2x, 5x, 10x, depending on how clear you are with the instructions.
Hmm.
But it's not going to, you can't just say, give me a class that does this and then expect it to work or not hallucinate or like not make syntactical errors, right?
Hmm.
It's like it saves it saves on the grunt work. Now, and this is where there's kind of a big question here around producing people who are able to do that validation. Because again,
Hmm.
I came up and like I'm, you know, early mid 30s now, where of that generation of we just still had to learn everything by hand.
Hmm. Hmm.
So we have more or less the the sense of the syntaxes. We have a sense of like what right looks like so that we can give good prompts. But people who are coming up and becoming developers today, without that rote work, how do they develop the abilities to validate that what they're producing is actually good, correct, well architected, and so on?
Hmm.
And that's not a question that I have the answer to. I just know that it's a significant industry concern. Like, okay, everybody who's a solution architect today is going to be fine, right? Like technical architects, they're just going to be able to produce more faster, and that's
Hmm.
great. But
Hmm.
how are we producing the next generation of solution architects, of senior BAs, of tech arcs? And I don't think the industry has a good answer for that just yet.
Hmm. And is that, how are you managing that? So as you bring team members in, how are you how are you measuring, how are you developing those younger versions of yourself that you're looking to grow and build and shape and mold into that developer that you're able to retask? Like how do you manage that culturally?
We try to make sure that everybody who's coming in at least has some level of technical skill beforehand,
Hmm.
right? So we have them do tech challenges, we have them do thought challenges or thought exercises in front of us. You know, being given technical challenges or business situations more or less, and asking them to not just solve it, but think in front of us and say, okay, how given business challenge A, given that this is the scenario that they want to accomplish, how would you set up the database to do this? What kind of ETL operations would need to be performed? What kind of mechanisms or methods would you use? What kind of interface would you set up for that? Now, whether, and this I think is where AI comes into play, it doesn't, we don't necessarily need them to write it all by hand. And this is where I think the shift has to happen a little bit for us
Hmm.
is yeah, it is hard, right? It is it's we're trying to make sure that they first and foremost, do they know how to think, right? Are
Hmm.
they creative in their thinking? Are they structured in their thinking? Are they able to plan things out ahead of time? Um, and then hopefully, you know, pair them with developers and technicians who have a bit more hands-on experience to help them develop that more refined sense. Um, because short of having them you know, do 100 lines a day on exorcism or any of the sites, it's it's going to be hard to kind of ingrain that into them. So I guess the to answer your question in a potentially unsatisfying way, we have some thoughts and we're trying to implement them, but we don't know
Yeah,
if how effective they're going to be just yet because it's still new to us too.
yeah. And I think that's, I don't think that's unsatisfying at all. And I think the reality is that there has to be a comfort and a willingness to participate in that exercise, and uh, the ability to just say, I don't know. And we're gonna try, we're gonna test, we're gonna fail, and then we're gonna iterate and we're gonna try again. And I think that's okay, and I think that approach needs to be applied to more things. Because it's okay to not know, and it's okay to fail, and it's okay to try again. That's how the greatest inventions of the world have come to be. It's not from knowing everything going into it. So I think that's okay. So,
But ultimately, we don't care that you know everything.
mhm,
We want to see when you don't know something, how you go about rectifying it,
mhm,
because we can't predict every scenario
mhm,
anyway.
mhm,
So we just need to know that you can figure it out because
mhm.
that's way more valuable than having 1,000 answers memorized.
Fair enough. Okay, so let's check out some quick questions here. How would you describe yourself in 3 words as a leader, as a person that's trying to guide into the next evolution of the business? What does that look like?
It's ambitious to start with, right? Like I want to do great and interesting things. I
Hmm.
want, at whatever scale we are doing the work and whatever products we're producing, them to be good, for them to
Hmm.
be elegant, for them to be useful, for them to be, if not a joy to experience, because there are just some business processes that are never going to be fun, as minimally painful as possible,
Hmm.
but ideally joyful, right? Ideally, it just goes through and you're at the end of working with something that we built and you go, "Oh, this was so easy, so nice. Like this really just made things um, smooth and streamlined."
Hmm.
Um, Second, I would want to say thoughtful, right?
Okay.
I'd want to make sure to kind of keep top in mind of not necessarily look before you leap, but just consider things, consider different perspectives, consider, is this the best way to be going about this? And ingrain that into the people that work with and for us. Because
Hmm.
what what I've seen, and while it's an admirable trait in some contexts, can cause more harm than good, is just leaping into action without thinking, right? Don't usually, sometimes yes, but like usually just don't do that.
Yeah.
Like think back as like, what am I about to do? Why am I doing it? And this goes back to kind of the why of like, understand what you're doing before you're doing it. Understand why you're doing what you're doing and think through. This is kind of, it's a bit of an army truism, but like no plan survives first contact, but
Mm.
you don't survive first contact without a plan, right?
That a plan.
The importance of doing the planning isn't necessarily that you end up following every step by step, but you've taken the time to consider, what are the other variables? What
Hmm.
could go wrong? What will hopefully go right? What does that look like? And trying to follow that path, but not necessarily doing it, just looking at the map before you take the first step down into the territory.
But interesting paradox, right? Because like, at what point are you leaping into action, and at what point are you leaping into action too soon versus at what point are you being too thoughtful, right?
Mhm.
And being able to measure that and maintain relativity between those two is,
Oh,
that's one of
oh,
those
it's
things.
exceptionally difficult, right? Like there's no hard answer, and
Right.
the approach in one situation might not be the right approach in another.
Hmm.
And uh, I'm sorry, that's life, right? There's no there's no cookie cutter um, way of handling every situation every time. We don't
So
know the
number
answers
three.
beforehand. What?
So number three.
I think I'm applying number two a little bit too much here. Um, I guess understanding, right? I think that that may have a
Okay.
little bit of of an overlap
Sure.
with thoughtful, but goes back into like trying to meet people where they live, right? Whether that's
Nice.
the people that
Yeah.
are working, for you or with you, like,
Mhm.
hey, why is it that you're not getting this thing right? Or why is it that you are able to get this thing right? And how can we communicate that to other people to understanding, and this is something that's really really can be really challenging to get developers to latch on to. But understanding what it's like to be the user that they're
Hmm.
building for,
Hmm.
and not just do something that works technically, because that is, I think, like the biggest mind shift that we have to get for any dev coming in is like, okay, you ran the tests and everything compiles, but what is it like to use the wizard you just built? What is it like to use the application you just built? Like, oh, this is awful. Like,
Hmm.
yeah. So
Right,
start with that. And this is why it overlaps with thoughtful quite a bit, but it's like
right.
understand the different facets of what you're doing, not just your lens on it.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, alternative perspectives for sure.
Yeah.
Do you have a guiding quote that sort of leads you down that path? Or do you have a quote that you look to are you a quote guy?
Really a quote guy, right?
Right.
Like I think there definitely was a time when I was, right? Like
Hmm.
I think that's the whole, like, especially going through college, right? I think by the quote on my Facebook timeline wall, whatever it was at the time, was
Yeah,
like
yeah.
was that quote by, I think it was Da Vinci, but it was like, I wish to work miracles,
Mm,
right? And that, I think, is like, that's, of course, that's something I kind of still hold dear, but it's not really a quote for me anymore. I think
mm,
as you, at least part of my process of like maturing and growing is like not needing to have mantras, not needing to have explicit things that I
mhm,
follow, but rather just making those rules, those mantras part of myself that I can refer to when needed, but not
mhm.
needing to apply as dogma.
Right, right. Do you have any routines, morning routine that scaffold you up or set you up that you rely on heavily?
Yeah. I mean, physical activity or gym is one thing, right? I started kind of powerlifting when I was 18, 19,
Okay.
and have done that minimum 2 to 3 times a week, every week, really,
Hmm.
other than when
Hmm.
traveling. Since it's just something that kind of anchors me. Um, More recently, my fiance and I got cats, so I've just fallen in love with those little buggers. So I will get up every day at like 5:15, come down and feed them. But then when they're done, the routine is I'm, kind of sitting doing work on the couch, and the the small one, they're a brother sister bonded pair.
Okay.
Her name is Pop Tart. She will, when she's finished, come up and very clearly let me know that it's her time to sit on my lap. She'll
Right.
just kind of poke me until that she gets that. So
Hmm.
I do that. I set to the side, and then she just does like the little circle thing and like just sits down. And so I do that for, another 20 minutes or so. And then I go to the gym. So that
Right.
really kind of centers me. It's like, start the day by melting my heart a little bit.
And then go lift heavy stuff. Yeah. What and feel free to skip this one if it's too vulnerable. What is the one thing that you're most afraid of? And it can be with the business, it can be personal, wherever you want to go with it is perfectly fine.
Getting tunnel visioned, right? Of just getting
Wow.
into the day
Okay.
to day of doing the thing,
Hmm.
because especially like the last year or two, and it's partly why we are trying to focus on productization. Like we've been in that just grind of delivery of just, and especially with some of the newer kind of smaller clients of just like, all right, just get the project out, just get the project out. And like, where have we really moved
Right.
from where we were a
Hmm.
year ago?
Hmm.
Yeah, we've got a bit more. Yeah, we've got a bit more in the war chest, but what else, right? Have any of us grown as professionals? Have any of us grown as, like, have we grown as a practice beyond just being a little bit larger?
Hmm.
And yeah, the answer is like no, right? We kind of had to take a look back and like we need to refocus as a company on this. Like, what are we going to be like? Are we going to be A Tata? Probably not. Do we want to
Right.
be a Tata? Probably not, right?
Hmm.
Tata has 400,000 employees, or the
Hmm.
consulting practice alone, right,
Hmm.
does. That's impressive. That's massive. But it's not the kind of work that's interesting. It's not the kind of work that's, from what we've seen, right, valuable. I'm sure they produce some. I'm sure some projects go well, but that's just not
Sure.
been my experience.
Hmm.
And but of course, the kind of the corporate response was very much, yeah, well, they paid us like 3 million for the project, so whatever, move on. And it's like, ah,
Hmm.
great, but also you're not professionals at that
Is
point. Like you're not a professional delivery organization
is there space for that in
at that
today's
scale. Probably not
like
at that scale. No, because everything has to be numbers on a spreadsheet, right? If you've got Sony and Warner Brothers
right?
and Lennar Homes and whatever else, they're all just lines to you.
Hmm.
I get it. I'm not saying this from like a position of judgment is the thing.
Hmm.
I'm just
Hmm.
saying that's not the kind of relationship I want to have with the work that I'm doing.
Of course, but I mean, like, just I don't know, like existentially, in the world as a whole, like how how did we get here, right? And like when did this become okay, where people are numbers and who cares they paid us? Like when did that?
People have always been numbers.
Uh,
That's no, and like at a certain level, it's just that
okay,
there's a lot more people, right? Like how did the feudal lords look at their peasants? Were they
yeah,
ever more than just numbers to them?
right.
For some, maybe not. Maybe
Mhm.
some were a bit more compassionate, a bit more, on the ground, a bit more understanding. But on average, no. You've always had different stratifications, and the ones who are higher up traditionally numberizing
And we're
folks.
referencing something from the 1600s. We're now however many hundred years later, and like where's the evolution in that, right? Like that's sort of the question. Like we're just dressed
Well, we could deal
differently.
with the numbers. We
We're
could deal
not.
with the numbers a lot faster, Chandler. You got to remember.
Yeah, for sure. It's no longer a spreadsheet, it's in a CRM, and we have automations around it so that we can look at the data more elegantly. Well, conversation for another day, I suppose. Um,
I think that's a bigger topic.
yeah, for sure. Your superhero guy, do you have a hero, a model, a mentor? What would you select, and what would that look like?
Um, Hokey, right? It's super hokey. But I
Totally.
think while part of me admires, Tony Stark probably
Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Love that.
more than I necessarily should,
I
although
could see that.
I have a significant pullback from that recently because he's
Mm.
also Elon Musk's favorite superhero, and I
That's hard.
fucking hate Elon Musk. I think he's absolute human garbage, but
Okay.
you can leave this in the, I don't care. Um, he's just such a compassionless piece of shit. But moving on.
Yep.
Um,
Hit a
I
soft
do
point.
still like the good aspects of Tony, like, yeah, a
Yeah.
little bit, but like
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
But more realistically, right? Honestly, Captain America, right? Just
Mm,
because he's naive, he is a Boy Scout, but his heart is always in the right place,
right.
right?
I can see
That
that too.
might lead to that might lead to him sometimes being overly myopic and not
Mm,
considering the
talk about
the
jumping
overall
in.
perspectives. But that's a problem. I'd rather have that as a personality flaw
Okay.
than heartlessness,
Right. Right.
right? Like I'd rather be overly stubborn because I believe in what I'm doing and work to, reconcile it and fix that, and not
Mm,
than to have to be convinced of the value of something other than the bottom line.
hmm. Hmm. Love that. I mean, that's it. That's all I got for you. Thank you. Thank you for the conversation. Any closing remarks? Any thoughts? Anything that we want to sign off with?
No,
All right,
No need to put a bullet on it.
we're good. We're good. All right. Well, I mean, I know where to find you. I can include that in the show notes for anyone that wants to reach out and work with you on building out their why and not just quick starting up a project or both, whatever works. Um, but thanks for the chat. Thanks for the discussion, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Chandler.
Thank you.
Take care.